Going live. All right, guys, we are live. You are back. It is Jack Murphy. This is the Jack Murphy Live podcast. This is a unique and rare opportunity where I'm actually hosting two incredible gentlemen at the same time. I've got John Robb here, the author of Brave New War, the most probably up-to-date and current analyst on networks and the combination of politics, technology, and warfare. Check out his blog, Global Guerrillas, also his Patreon as well, John Robb, best Patreon in the universe. I also have Adam Townsend, somebody I have been dying to talk to for a number of months, even a couple of years. Adam is a former Wall Street executive who founded a baking firm and sold it, an early venture investor in the New York City in the mid-1990s .com times. He was part of founding the admin staff, which went public in the late 90s, then TriNet and Workday and Slack. He calls himself an extreme salesman. And he is here live with us, Jack Murphy, John Robb, Adam Townsend. How are you guys doing, sir?
Doing great.
Awesome.
I'm doing really good. Yeah, really good.
Awesome. Glad to have you guys. So Adam was the one who had this idea of us three getting together to talk about current events. We want to talk about what's been going on with Antifa, what's been going on with Black Lives Matter, what's been going on with the protests, what's been going on with the riots. How does this fit into our mental models of the world? How does this fit in with Adam's notions of a people operating system? How does it fit in with John's model of emergent networks and insurgencies? What is it? How does it jive with what I saw on the ground? And we can take comments and questions as they come up throughout the chat. But this is going to be an open-ended, free-flowing conversation. And I'm going to start it off by asking John. John,
yes,
I know you spend a lot of time on these issues. You write about it all the time on Patreon and on your blog, and you are currently up to date 100% as anybody else. So what has been your reaction to the last couple of weeks with Black Lives Matter, the protests, riots, Antifa? How does it fit in with your existing model? Update us on what you see happening with your insurgent network or network insurgencies going on. And let's get this thing going, John.
Well, it's a classic open source protest. And open source protest goes back to the open source development model. We saw it move from software development to warfare in the Iraq War. And then we saw it ported to protests in the Islamic world, Egypt and Tunisia, toppling governments there. We've seen it used in Puerto Rico to topple the governor and in a variety of other places. What it basically is a protest or a movement that comes together very, very quickly based on a single plausible promise, a single idea. It's the only thing you can get a lot of people to agree on. It's got to be simple, and it's got to be actionable, and it has to actually be proven successful enough to generate a crowd. And the people that assemble to support it, to move it forward towards completion, come from a variety of different backgrounds. They have a lot of different reasons for protesting, for joining the movement, and they don't necessarily agree with each other. Okay, they can be polar opposites, because what we saw in the Iraq War and the open source insurgency is that there were 70 different groups, and there were a bunch of different flavors of jihadi that would knife each other if they were in the same room. They had criminal organizations. They had nationalists that supported Saddam, those who didn't. And the same thing we saw there is something that we're seeing now in this protest, is that everybody who wanted to protest Trump and wanted to protest the current environment used this as a way of doing that, and they all joined. And anyone who was interested in destabilizing the United States joined in also. So we have the bulk of the people are operating on a relatively peaceful basis, but we also have more violent elements slotting themselves in to try to destabilize it, to get it to reach a different level of engagement with the U.S.
What is the plausible promise here? What is attracting these disparate groups to coalesce in this very moment to take action? Yeah,
I'm seeing a lot of moral elements in this one. what seems to be the basis of this is that it's equalizing the power relationship between the police and the populace, defanging the police, making them less effective at calling a protest or being able to exert power from the establishment or those who are in charge. That seems to be the kind of objective. We're seeing that in the defunding efforts. We're seeing that in the pledging of support where people are kneeling, kind of giving their oath to the crowd, and bending their knee. Taking a knee becomes bending a knee, and then that's the core focus. And anything that moves it along towards that tends to be the accepted by the crowd and supported and advanced.
Do you think that is the goal, or that is an intermediate goal, the equalizing the power between the people and the police? Is that the end destination, or is this just like a hop on the way to the long range destination? And if so, what do you think that might be?
Well, for this protest, that is the end destination. Okay. So, as soon as that dissolves, as soon as that either forks too much that it becomes diffuse and ineffective, or achieves a relative success in that it causes a lot of defunding events, a lot of reorganizations in police departments, forcing police into a defensive crouch so they don't engage with crowds, they don't take action when they see street crime or property crime, like we're seeing in some states, then it will fall apart, and then there has to be another reason for the open source protest to come together. Open source is very, this kind of open source movement protest is very good at rapid mobilization. Look at this. What other protest could go to 2,800 different cities around the world in a matter of days? It's an organizational feat that just can't be matched in using other organizational methodologies, and the tens of millions of people that showed up to support it. And it's very effective. It's built to take on bigger foes. The insurgency in Iraq was built to take on the U.S. military. And the U.S. military, being the sole superpower at the time, was supposed to be good enough and had the resources and had the bench necessary to defeat it. But that open source insurgent dynamic allowed them to hold it at a standstill, basically wear it out over the course of 3 or 4 years.
Patience, very important in a fourth generation war. That is for sure. Adam, what do you think about John's idea about the plausible promise being the thing that's attracting all of these groups together? Do you agree with that? Do you think that the promise is accurate? How do you see it? What's motivating people?
Well, of course I agree. John's an authority. I'm very selective about what information I allow in, because once it's kind of in my head, it's such a tedious process to extract it, and it takes so much effort to take it out of my head. So, I've read John's book. I'll give you a little bit of background and to answer your question fully. And John and I discussed this a little bit yesterday. Going back 4 years, I was a fan of John's blog before he had a Patreon, and I called John, and I was very interested in his resilient cities. Both from what I was seeing within some very good friends of mine who ran forensic nodes against the Bitcoin mining operations that had overwhelmed Venezuela, which I'm sure John probably knows kind of on the periphery about, which is where these gangs took over towns. And how much of that was the elites within Venezuela and the petro is still unknown. But nevertheless, they were stripping towns of all the electricity, and it was done not only as an extortion scheme, but it was done as a way to, and not just take over the towns, but it was done as a way to install new administrations. Because if you control the electricity, you control the town, right? It's the same thing you had in Upper Mongolia with the Bitcoin mining farms and everything there. So I was much more interested. John and I spoke at that time 4 years ago, and I was very interested in, okay, well, in New York City, we don't have that, right? We don't have that type of infrastructure vulnerability. We don't have that type of a 4D warfare on our electrical grid going on, which is what you have happening throughout the world that Americans are just so lucky we don't see. which is the protest will take over actual the apparatus of the government. It's really wild to see. So I was very interested, and John will probably recall this because we refreshed our memories on it yesterday. I said, well, how will this exhibit itself within New York? And if it does become this kind of a system, this type of open warfare system that John, elegantly has described throughout his career, then how can we respond to that? And I was very interested. I anticipated the crises we were going through now, at least, not with its severity, right, and not with as much operational support as they've been given by media and everything else. But I certainly saw that this was the way it was going. So I reached out to John 4 years ago and I said, well, John, when this comes to America in this form, how can we respond? And locally within New York, where I know everybody, I know all the politicians, I know all the power elite, I know everything. What's our best way of responding to it in a healthy way? I live here, and how can I kind of mitigate all the agitation and everything else, both politically, and do I just pack up and move? I saw it was coming on, and I said, do I just get the heck out of New York and hopefully I can outrun the mob? So John's an expert. I defer to John. Long-winded way of saying I defer to John. John knows what he's talking about, whatever he says.
Well, it's hard to argue with that, I guess. John, one of the things that I was wondering about, you mentioned the phrase fork the insurgency. I'm slightly familiar with that when it comes to like crypto and blockchain events and things like that. I'm not an expert on it by any means whatsoever, but I do understand what you mean by fork the insurgency in the sense of like splitting these groups away from their the goal that they've coalesced around. How have you seen maybe that playing out? Is it playing out? Do you anticipate it playing out? If not, is there something that you could suggest if you were in such a position to make advice about how to fork an insurgency like this and how to split the groups?
Yeah, a fork is what happens to an open source movement when a smaller group decides to pursue a different goal, and they convince enough of those people who are formerly participating in the bigger movement to come with them. And it can also have kind of larger effects, like for instance in the Iraq War, and the reason why we were able to wrap it up to a certain degree is that a subsection of the Iraqi insurgency decided to blow up the Golden Mosque, and that incident caused the Shia militias to start ethnic cleansing in Baghdad. And that, massive militias walking through the town, taking out neighborhood after neighborhood. And that put the tribal elements that were working as part of the and the neighborhood in Baghdad at risk. They were fighting both the United States and these massive Shia militias, and that caused them to give up. They ended up cutting a deal with the U.S. for protection. And luckily, we were able to see the signal and actually see it. Because I wrote an article, op-ed in '95 in the New York Times that basically said, "This is how you solve it. Get the Shia militias to start doing something like this." It's a horrible way of doing it, but it was a way of running it to conclusion. So 3 years later, that's exactly what happened, but by chance. So in this case, what's going on and what's potentially forking it? Things like what we saw with Occupy. Okay, where people start making lists of demands that are, a mile long. They have, laundry lists, and they start to move off in all these different directions, and their demands of the local city councils and the demands of this or that become so onerous that people just don't take them seriously, and people argue over it, and they start dispersing from the movement. We see a little bit of that with the TAZ. I call it they call it the CHAZ. That temporary autonomous zone in Seattle, that has a different motive. It's not necessarily geared towards the plausible promise of this protest. They're taking it in a different direction, and that's a fork. And it's almost a way to de-escalate an open source protest is allow it to fork like that. Allow it to get off topic and soak up their energies and start squabbling internally, and that internal squabble becomes enough to shatter it and shatter the movement.
One thing I've noticed about the guys in Chaz and Adam, I'm going to ask you, who do you think these people are in just a minute? One thing I've noticed about the Chaz fork, which is a good way of calling it now, is that they went from operating in a 4G space to basically going back to like trench warfare. They're like, now we have a perimeter. We must defend the perimeter. And it's like they're standing in a line with a gun against people trying to get in or out of where they are. And that doesn't seem to me to be in line with like an insurgency, a 4G insurgency in this context. It seems to be sort of an error that was made on the ground, at least from my perspective. And it is fascinating to see how the thing can splinter apart. And if somebody wanted to splinter it apart, it sounds to me like one option would be to like float unreasonable demands, try to make them look like they're coming from the insurgency group, try to just sort of make them look absurd or make things as crazy as possible to make people lose interest. It's interesting to think who's actually following along. And this is something I really want to explore. Like, Adam, who do you think the people are in the protests? Who do you think the people are rioting? Who do you think the people are in Chaz? Are they the same? Are they different? Is it sneakier than we think? Is it as obvious as they're saying? Like, what do you think, Adam?
Do I also get to ask John questions? Because I've got follow-up questions to what John just said.
Do it, man. Go for it, Adam.
So it's interesting because I'm watching the Raz, the Warlord. It's awesome. The whole thing is insane. And if I had been given the opportunity, if I was the warlord of my own autonomous zone, my list would be like 10 times longer. Just so you know, I've got a lot of things I want. So I don't know if you noticed, but recently, and I tweeted it out, they had created this like community council for some type of civic resolutions of things. Did you see that, John?
I think so. Yeah.
Jack, did you see it? It had like 9 edits to it? Did you see that?
Yeah.
And it was just this most remarkable thing just to watch this kind of, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't understand it. And John understands the things in his own type of view. I just look at it as just absolute chaos. And my friends from around the world looked at it, and we're kind of used to this type of chaos, this type of insanity, right? It's insanity. Right. And throughout those 9 edits, and it was interesting because then that was, they tried to scrub it. So I took screenshots of it just as this kind of memorialization of the insanity, right? And how it was kind of being corrupted. But when they took that out, was that them trying to resolve this fork? So were they trying to take that fork? You said that the way these things divide up and the way they fork is, you know, they'll kind of move in different directions. So here was a direction, and they'll lose credibility, right? By doing that, they'll lose moral authority, they'll lose authority, and they'll lose their persuasion that they had that kept everybody contained. So when they took out those the civic resolution, whatever that they had within Chaz, was that their way of trying to recapture that fork that they saw splitting?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's anything that's off topic, anything that's off the main thrust of the movement is a fork. So anything that was, you know, geared specifically to the Chaz, specifically to certain needs that they had that weren't part of this movement is a fork. And yeah, it's very hard because the chaotic elements in this are pretty extreme. There's a way around that, though, is that in an open source protest, it doesn't necessarily have to be just individuals. It could be very tightly run groups. Okay, and a tightly run group, which is, you know, authoritarian in its nature, is perfectly welcome within the context of an open source movement. And if you have a tightly run group and you have access to a temporary autonomous zone, you can do really wild stuff. And for instance, in the Iraqi insurgency, you know, take over of Fallujah allowed them to open it up to bomb factories, to all sorts of different development that allowed the insurgency to powered the insurgency over the course of the entire country, over the breadth of the entire country. So the knowledge is, or the insight is, it's a temporary zone. It's a headache. but it's only temporary, and then allows you to do certain things. And those things have to be focused on moving the insurgency forward or moving the movement forward. If you start to have other ideas in terms of trying to make it permanent and try to turn it into a habitable zone, or trying to, have other demands for other grievances they have with the city and with the country, then it just turns into something that will pretty soon after the movement slows down be rolled up.
Right. Like the original list of demands from Black Lives Matter didn't include creating autonomous zones in the middle of our major cities. Right. So it's a little bit of a distraction. And this thing that Adam's referencing, I think the acronym was CRAC, CARK, something about a council and resolution or something. And what he's referencing is the fact that they said, okay, we're going to have 5 people on this council. None of them are going to be white dudes. They're going to be this, that, and other. And then the next edit was like, okay, well, you forgot about this, the disabled green person from this part of the country. Okay, we got to do that. And they went through the whole intersectional slicing and dicing of every oppressed group. And they're like, oh crap, we got to get even more people. Oh, we need even more people. And before you know it, they went from like 4 or 5 to like 12 different people. And it just, the absurdity of watching it happen sort of in real time was actually a great demonstration to see intersectionality in action, intersectionality in the wild, sort of how it works and how impossible it is to use it as a basis for social cohesion or the foundation of any future society, which is, I think, the goal. Intersectionality is clearly the moral framework that the Black Lives Matter, the white fragility folks, the anti-racist folks, that they're operating under, right? It's their new religion, I think.
Well, so let me kind of intrude within it here, because I'm less interested in kind of the driving ideology, because I don't think that's particularly coherent, right? I mean, there's no, my family were World War II vets, and the history of the civil rights movement was how much that experience, and John, I'm sure, will know a lot more, and other people who are vets will know a lot more kind of the history of this and the historical record. But from my own studies, which are fairly extensive, I read all the Taylor Branch books, and my own family, which became academic in this, is that kind of Black and Jews uniting and the South uniting, and this kind of conversion and transformation of the Southern Church that occurred after World War II when everybody came back from war. And I can tell you about it from our own family experience. It was a very real type of thing that people had never had a chance to meet before. And so I don't really assign what I'm seeing to anything with an ideological or theological or historical nucleus to it. And that's, I was very interested in what John said about there's this kind of one driving almost mean that moves the population, and that's, I suppose, because otherwise they're just going to squabble within each other. So I'm less interested in that and its intersectionality. I thought that crack thing was very interesting, also because if you did the math at the end of it, they had divided initially they had divided Asians up kind of monolithically. And they said, hey, if you're Asian, you're on this, here you go. And then if you did the math by edit 9, they had given Asians basically a 2/5. They had 2/5 the Asians, which I thought was remarkable, that they did not even give them adequate representation. So I'm less interested in that, because because I realize that has to deteriorate. But now I'm very interested in watching as it has already crumbled, right, where it's become establishment now. I mean, if it's now such a part of the media and it's now become a tourist site, it's a tourist destination at this point. It's a tourist destination. I mean, it is what it is. People want to go there so they can take their selfie there. Having lived through 9/11 here, and I lost a lot of friends to it, I watched that become a selfie opportunity for people. And so its emotional potency has been entirely lost of whatever a Chaz was supposed to be. And I see it instead. I'm trying to look through it differently, which is also why I'm so interested in John, because my former bosses and colleagues over at Rand Corp have written a lot on the Emerald City protest, on the Seattle protest, and on on various organizational schemas of how you create disruptions and how they're managed, both the public relations of it, where I see CNN has clearly become this kind of public relations arm of Chaz and of whatever its Paleolithic movement, kind of is. And now they're trying to propel it because it had lost its own meaning. They're now trying to turn it into this Disney World for radicals, and clearly they're now trying to franchise it out and have it be set up around. It's very clear. I mean, it's becoming a franchise very, very, very quickly, and now they're trying to replicate it around the country. So I'm less interested in kind of the Black Lives Matters element of it, because that's in itself so highly emotionally charged, and where it takes such a great amount of human conversation to be able to kind of piece whatever it is together, or piece what take away whatever it's not. I'm much more interested now in how it's also kind of franchising out, and it's franchising out very opportunistically, so that it's going to, whoever's not an adherent, right, is now going to be chased out of their homes, right? So if it's, I can see it clearly is going to move to Texas next, and it's going to move to some of the kind of more conservative hubs, chasing out the local populations, getting adherence, and then, as John said, kind of getting people to take a knee.
What do you think, John?
Excuse me?
I said, what do you think about that, John?
Yeah, that it could have spread, that it could franchise out. If it's too much of a departure from the original movement, though, it's not going to have the heft. It's not going to take in this iteration. But if it can be molded into something that advances the movement, we'll see it. It's generally something that we're going to see in protests moving forward, because I mean, what we basically are experiencing is a kind of a defanging of the police. The police are in a defensive crouch. I mean, they can't apply force, particularly in a public setting, without getting severe repercussions. I mean, people get fired, people go to jail over even minor stuff. And now we're seeing tear gas bans and generalized bans on non-lethals, and what that does to the police force as a whole is that it puts them into a force protection posture. I mean, they have no power to use against the protest, even if it gets out of hand. And what they'll do is they'll just withdraw from it. So if the protest wants to advance, they'll back off. If the protest wants to loot, they'll back off. They want to avoid the confrontation, avoid getting in a situation where they get hurt, and it makes them completely ineffective. And that is that kind of reducing that feedback loop, that mitigation loop, that kind of negative damping that that slows down a protest, is going to lead to some interesting things. I mean, we'll see protests that range a lot farther afield. They get bigger, and that can take buildings and hold them, and take structures that we didn't think were possible. Going in and maybe even taking the White House and trampling it over, and no one's there to defend it. No one's willing to actually put up the defense necessary to stop it from being trampled, or looting and selective looting, like we saw in Hong Kong, where certain businesses were targeted. I mean, the businesses that supported the protest weren't vandalized. They didn't loot, but they focused on vandalization, because they didn't want to be portrayed as criminals by the Chinese government. And then the other businesses that supported the Chinese government, that had done backroom deals or part of a national chain, were targeted, like banks and the like, and they were often gutted. So we can see that here in the States, where there's kind of a selective kind of pressure. There's a word I like to use. It's called alignment. There's a lot of what we're seeing in networks is in network warfare is forcing alignment, forcing people to support and face in the same direction as the network. If the government controls the network, like China, they're forcing corporations and individuals to align themselves. to publicly align themselves and do this so on an ongoing basis, not just domestically but globally, and that what we're seeing with a lot of these movements online is they're trying to force that same alignment, forcing people to kind of in their public actions and their behaviors express support or continue to give credibility to the unit or to the protest and the like. So that's my thinking on it.
I've seen so much, Adam. I'm just sorry, I could jump right in real quick for a second. I've seen so much of this forced alignment happening everywhere. All of the corporations forced to send over hundreds of millions of dollars, in some case like $1 billion. Where's all that money going? It's a very good question. Who's going to account for that? That'll be funny. There's been forced alignment when the Anti-Defamation League sends out reading lists to the PTAs across the country with white fragility and anti-racism at the top of the list, injecting them directly into our students' lives, bypassing the parents, sending it to the schools, putting it into their curricula, doing these like community meetings that they have every week at some schools where they talk about these issues. They ask these kids to explore and sit with their racism, et cetera, et cetera. So there is this forced alignment happening on all fronts. And later, I do want to circle back to sort of the display of force and how that impacted what I saw on the ground in terms of the rioters. But Adam, you've got something you wanted to say on that subject. Go for it.
Yeah. Well, and let me just go backwards a little bit. After what you said, I don't know anything about I don't know a lot about kind of the social language that you've used. So, I can't say that I've observed, agree, or disagree with any of them. Okay, just because I don't know what these things are. Honestly, I just don't know what these things are. The terminology, whether I don't have an opinion on, I'm just not informed on anything. So I just want to kind of, just kind of give some framework for that is just not what I'm, I don't know. I'm just not involved in these little kind of social kind of small issues, even though I understand they have greater implications. When I see Chaz, though, it's interesting. I've watched it because Americans are not used to what other countries have experienced. And, John's referenced a lot of what he's observed within an Iraqi kind of oil spot type of, system of advancement of kind of almost a tactical guerrilla type of warfare, and how it advances within and becomes this hierarchy and then seizes control. And it's very interesting. However, what I see, Americans are not used to seeing United Front, which is kind of a political and economic apparatus that's very highly evolved from China, that has a whole bunch of different purposes. Americans have not seen that, and have not seen a lot of very coercive measures that the Chinese Communist Party has done within other countries, which includes, Australia, which these are regular events in Australia. I mean, Australia universities have been completely co-opted by the Chinese Communist Party, so that economically the entire school system cannot exist without the Chinese Communist Party. Europe is going through its own significant challenges, and they no longer have the capacity to be able to resist that type of an element because they're already so fractured. And Canada's already had this, but Australia is probably the best example. So Americans are not used to seeing what I've observed both in India and in China about the driving forces behind some of these, and how they infiltrate our think tanks, they infiltrate media, they infiltrate greedy politicians, particularly those that have retired from office, either kind of voluntarily or kind of been termed out, or however they are no longer in office, and they're kind of not smart enough to become a lobbyist. Lobbyist is more than just a person who's going to be able to connect dots. They need a lobbyist. From my experience, I've known a lot. It's not just a kind of a network. It's also just this deeper comprehension of how to articulate issues and all the kind of the nuances of these type of things. And a lot of, from what I've seen in the people who have been easily infiltrated in Australia, in Africa, and I was just in South America, are kind of the lesser politicians, the ones whose careers in many cases were built on agitating or built on this kind of aristocracy. So they're very good at prying into the kind of the aristocracy, aristocrat politicians. Hey, you know, my dad was this, my grandfather was this. I'm not particularly the smartest guy. They're offering me $1 billion real estate deal for no money down. It's just kind of very interesting to watch. And now I'm seeing this in America. So when I hear Raz, the warlord of Chaz, right? I know his rhetoric. I haven't studied it all. I'm, you know, of course, very sympathetic to the kind of the suffering, you know, that he expresses, because I think that's very genuine and actuality. However, it's also clearly now been infused with a lot of formalized, rigid United Front Chinese Communist Party propaganda and its mechanism. So I'm not sure. Normally, what their process is they'll bring people over to China to do, you know, hey, look, you know, we're not the imperialist oppressor that America is. Look how well we treat our black people. Look how well we treat our economically disadvantaged. And China is very good at giving Americans tours. China is incredibly good at giving Westerners tours. It's to the point that it's actually nice. I can't hear you. Yeah. John, I want to hear your dog now bark back to his. So I want to hear like this whole kind of thing going on. So it's interesting because clearly he's been trained, and I can see that. I was watching some videos, and again, I'm not watching within an idea. I'm trying to watch as a disembodied intellect, right? I'm not really trying to watch and assign my own type of emotional reserves to it. I'm interested in it because of how it fits in my futurist type of thinking, which I'll discuss a little bit. But there's a reason that other people aren't beating him up. I mean, he's not particularly menacing. He doesn't have a significant physical presence. He does seem to be charismatic, and so I think that adds to it. But being a charismatic leader also has much more vulnerabilities than being the type of leader that can, you know, beat you over the head. Right? Charismatic leaders you can much more easily displace than the type of leader who's acquired that position by hitting people over the head and by cruelty, right? You need to have cruelty to be a leader. So we haven't seen any exhibition of his cruelty. So to me, he's got a whole support network behind him that's propelling this, right?
So you think he's been trained by somebody, prepared for this?
I don't want to infer him, right, as an individual, because I don't really know him, right? I haven't had a chance to speak with them. I don't know. I can only tell you what I've observed, right? And I'm not talking about the cause that he expresses and or his talents, because clearly he is a very charismatic person, seems to be very relatable. He has an intimate, the little videos I've seen of him, there's a lot of intimacy, right? People like talking with him, and that they're not just kind of granting him authority. He naturally does have some authority in his interactions with people, but that's what I've observed also, is that when I've seen him in physical confrontation places where he's wildly outnumbered and he's around kind of a mob that's out of his own control, because that's kind of what John described as a, you know, the group only works as long as it's not fractured. But the second that you have a lot of human interactions going on, it's going to get fractured, right? The second people have a chance to say a couple of words to each other, they're not going to be in agreement much longer. So they've got to keep that rage going. They've got to keep that kind of feedback loop going. And I saw him breaking up fights. It's like there's no reason people aren't beating this guy up. It's not this type of a natural, organic authority that he's got. And I've seen this elsewhere, right? I've seen it in India, I've seen it in Pakistan, and I've particularly seen it with how the Chinese United Front apparatus works.
John, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I've visited all the garden spots and that were wrecked by civil war and the like when they were hot. So I saw how people were agitated and got involved and how these groups sprang up. I do think, though, that the focus on the Chaz is a little bit of a head fake. The real big thing here is that it's forcing alignment. The movement's forcing alignment within the big corporations, and particularly the big social networking giants, the Amazon and the like, and they're changing their way in which they interact with people on a mass scale. I mean, just like, for instance, seeing the books that they're proposing and having those put in front of you and seeing white fragility every day. I mean, being pushed as a book, let alone all the other little subtle things that are behind the scenes that were being changed in order to accommodate and align themselves with the movement. And when you're talking about changing things on a national scale, that kind of power consolidation is key. I don't see this as a revolutionary movement on the whole. I see it as a consolidation of power for the dominant, and that this is not about challenging the people in power. It's consolidating the power in a way that will allow them to exclude people like Trump and others from power, and do it in a repeatable way.
John, can you please drill down on that a little bit? Please explain how the Black Lives Matter, Antifa, open source protests and riots are meant to consolidate power in the establishment.
Well, can we just remove the let's back out those particular movements if it's possible, because I think it kind of introduces where we have to piece into each of its kind of little component issues that it is. And if we can just back out of that and instead just kind of look at, this phalanx, right? There's a phalanx that's on the street. I'm less interested in which army the phalanx, right, is fighting on behalf of, or like what kingdom they're fighting on behalf of, than or the tools that they're wielding aren't. If I'm going to get hit with a hammer, who hits me in the head with the hammer isn't that much of a concern to me. So is there any way of having that same conversation without having an obligation to kind of go into the actual issues of Black Lives Matter? Because there's a lot of complexity to that.
Well, that's what I do. Is just that in an open source movement, it really doesn't matter who the component groups are. I mean, they're slotting in, and they each have their own motivations for joining, and much more complex than much more nuanced than the core thrust of the movement. But they're all part of a larger dominant consensus in the country that clearly, I mean, looking at the support for the protests, even when bad behavior was in evidence, and through the looting and in many major metropolitan areas, shows that it is the dominant. It is kind of a dominant movement, and getting most politicians to align with that, getting cities to flip on it quickly, to get all the companies to express support and make changes to how they behave en masse, to get the big social networks that get inside our head, that are sitting in between each other, all of us. And every conversation that we have nowadays is mitigated and mediated by these social networks and these companies. They're forcing changes on them, and so the extreme version of this, of course, is what we see in China, where the government and the corporations and the dominant consensus is all one, and it dictates, and it uses the network, and it uses gamified versions in terms of the social credit system to enforce it down to the individual level and change behavior. So this is a dominant movement. It's not a revolutionary movement. It's propagating consensus, and you don't have to focus on the individual groups in order to see it.
So let me ask you a question, and I'm just so happy to be able to ask you these questions too. So awesome.
Oh, okay.
And which came first, the movement, or the corporation's desire to have this movement? I mean, if I were to take, so I keep a log, right?
Right.
I started a log in 2015, and well, I've always kept a log, but I've started one type of log in 2015, and then in 2019 I started a log about COVID. Okay, and I started it because I saw what was I'm very familiar with China, right? With a lot of the operational issues and kind of the people operating system, and I'm pretty familiar with it, both particularly financially and some of the economic issues within it. And so I saw that the protest had completely gained moral authority, that the police could no longer handle it kind of provincially, that it had just kind of the protests that you were seeing in Hong Kong, you're only seeing those because that's where all the media was. There was just as many protests going on, actually a lot more violent going on in the mainland. And after they burned down the university, or after the People's Armed Police intrusion in the university, they had lost all type of people background. So then all of a sudden, and there was a lot of triads doing a lot of violent things in service to the People's Armed Police, and so and then all of a sudden this COVID came around, and there was a way of really channeling up dissent, and how much of the COVID was embellished in order to channel dissent is something I found very interesting. So I started a log at that point, and the log was COVID January, COVID February, COVID March, and now that we're into June, I'm recording what's happening here, and I can kind of see kind of I can watch the water moving downstream, and I don't see any of this exclusive. I see the relationship between the channeling of dissent there, and how that dissent expressed itself, which is different than it is here for a lot of different reasons. Are you there?
Yep.
Okay. So dissent expressed, it's a different people operating system. So China is not America over there. It's a much different system. Right. Culturally, legalistically, there's just a whole bunch of different systems. So within their system, right, they can react. If they want to change things, they can change it on a dime. Okay. If I want to change a law, I don't need to get your permission to change a law. It's going to be changing. They changed the Constitution, and they stripped away all the People's Congress powers. They just did a lot of changes that you didn't hear about, but it really substantive changes that just basically stripped away all the political power that people had within the mainland, and made their own local provincial government inaccessible to them. So it's very interesting to watch. In our system, we still have the burden of the way I view it. I'm a futurist, right? In our system, we still have the burden of trying to preserve the appearance of continuity, right? We can't have this violent overnight change. People would resist. Everybody would be on its feet resisting if they were to say, hey, we're going to change the Constitution in this way. So in our people operating system, we need to be able to still have the appearance of this continuity. That's the way I view it. I mean, this is my own kind of thinking about the thing, but we need to have our own appearance of continuity, this kind of facade that our institutions and everything still exist. So as I saw COVID happening and everybody locking everybody up in their house, and kind of the media machinations that were required to kind of keep this to keep this foremost in people's thoughts, so that they would volunteer themselves to be locked up in their house, and volunteer and coerce others, which was happening around the Western countries, where they were in Germany, they were reporting each other for, if your kid was out seen playing, they would report you literally to the police. In England, it's crazy. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. I've kept the log. I'm an expert on it. So as we saw COVID beginning to die down, not just in terms of the actual number of reported cases, in terms of the reported deaths, we saw the cases going up, but we saw it being somewhat commensurate with the number of tests that were out there. All right. So we weren't seeing anything.
Yeah, there was one little other factor there, though. It took us 2-3 months to figure out how to sequester the people most vulnerable, to actually protect them well. So if you look in Florida, you'll see the cases going up among the younger people, under 50s, and going down for the older people, but we've learned how to actually protect. So if we had that ability at the get-go, this would have blown through. I mean, it would have been a no-brainer, but it took months.
Hold on, can I ask you something? Yeah. How do you know that? I mean, you're making a pretty strong statement as though I have to accept it because it's fact. You're saying if we had known, then this would have occurred. Why do I have to accept what you?
No, it's a learning process in terms of how to figure out how to properly protect people in rest homes, how to properly protect people who are most vulnerable. It wasn't something that you could do out of the box. The UK tried it. I mean, they said, okay, let's try to figure out a way to sequester these people, these vulnerable populations, which in the US is huge. I mean, 37% of our population was vulnerable to the virus. It wasn't something you could do as an initial strategy before a pandemic. It's something you had to learn how to do. And you know what, we made the big lie going on today, and we always end up into these big kind of delegitimizing lies, is that no politician is out there saying, okay, we're willing to accept a couple thousand people dead a day. We basically are allowing communicable cancer or heart disease on that level, but we're going to try to keep it contained within that so we can continue to have our lives. We're willing to accept that. I mean, that's the policy. That's the de facto policy, but nobody's up there saying, okay, this is what we're willing to do. And that we're still kind of giving most politicians are giving a head nod to eradicating it through measures or ignoring it, like it doesn't even exist. So it's like a weird kind of hyper normalization kind of thing going on here that it's very confusing to people.
Well, so okay, but I want to go backwards because again, I have to accept your assumptions, which I don't.
Oh, okay.
Let me go back to kind of the inception of it, because I've archived all of this. Mm-hmm. And so your assumption is that there's so many of them that are built within that it would be hard for me even just to do kind of the forensics on it, because the entire thing is built upon an assumption, and then it's kind of like this bubble theory of assumptions that I've got to have some agreement with.
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't do that. Okay, what I will say is let's just stick with what the actual facts are, the absolute facts, something that corresponds with true, right? Okay. So December, January, massive protests in Hong Kong. All right. For the last 3 years, massive protests in Europe about the yellow vest, and about in Germany all the taxes, and about the Catalan separatists. In Greece about immigration, and they're still pissed off about the austerity measures, and rightfully so, and about the Deutsche Bank bailout that they were forced to do, and about kind of this EU kind of political administrative quagmires that it finds himself in with Brexit, and how to kind of properly fund different things, and at the same time how to distribute it. There's just a lot of protests going on. So what we do know for fact is that in January, in December and January, there were protests going on throughout the world.
Right.
Can we agree that that's one fact?
Oh yeah, no, I see where you're going with this. Can I? I think I do. Okay. Because it's right on. You're exactly right in what you're saying. But do you mind if I just take one little break? I've been drinking coffee all morning.
Yeah, no problem. Go for it, Adam. Keep going here. Roll with it.
He's awesome. I drink about 2 gallons of water a day. So in advance of this, I couldn't drink any water last night.
We're live, Adam. We're live. Keep rolling on subject.
But it is. It's true. I'm craving water is what I'm really trying to say. So it's interesting because I'm going to wait for him to get back. But in any event, it's interesting because, again, I still have to accept the assumption, which I don't want to do. So
what is the assumption? Let me write it down.
Okay, that had we had that the information that we obtained along the way became the data sets were becoming better and better, so we could observe more in real time measures that could be taken to sequester older people and to save lives and to do this, and so the assumption that I have to agree with is first that the information was pristine, or even that the data that we were being provided was true. mean, things have to correspond with fact, and I don't think that they ever were. So I think we first have to get an agreement on the quantitative and qualitative aspects of the information that we were provided. If we can't get agreement on that, then how can I agree with John's statement that we learned how to sequester old people to save their lives, and also how to keep young people alive? I mean, it's one has to kind of sequentially build upon the other.
Yeah, I think for me, the most important data point in all the corona stuff is just deaths, right? Like, all the other issues are what they are.
Okay, so can I stop you there? You there?
Sure.
What do you mean deaths? I mean, deaths of what? I mean, when you say deaths, help me understand what you mean.
What I mean is deaths above and beyond what was typical in an ordinary year at that time.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. All right.
So we're drilling down, John, on
so
the
you were saying that just to recap is that the pandemic gave an opportunity to the global elites to consolidate power and eliminate these protests, and I heartily agree. In the most cynical way possible, the pandemic allowed a consolidation of power on a global scale that we haven't seen.
No, I didn't say that.
You did not say it? Okay.
No. I mean, that's a part of what I said. I mean, first we have to also agree on what pandemic is, right? Because pandemic actually did not have an adequate definition. I mean, this happened before in 2009 with the swine flu, H1N1 swine flu, and at that time there actually was an inoperable definition of pandemic. Pandemic is just a term like flatten the curve or something else that's thrown into a vernacular that has no significant science meaning to it, but it's something that's nice for people to say. But particularly at that time where pandemic was inadequately defined. So we still haven't figured out or come to an agreement about what this pandemic was, how we were observing the pandemic, and was the information that we were given, the data, truthful? And so is the information that we have calculated and are now formulating this discussion upon sincere? Was it authentic information? So let's go back to December, January then. So December, January, there were all these riots going on. Then in January, it was actually December, but let's just state January because that's the timeline that most people have. We saw the videos on Twitter, which all of us have a life on Twitter, of people in China dropping dead, okay? Spontaneously combusting on a street, basically, from COVID. Now, I'm pretty familiar with China. I knew that wasn't possible, right? I know how videos leak out of China, and I know how they're not gonna leak out of China. And if they were to leak out of China, the difficulty that they would have finding a viewer, especially on Twitter and social media, which is very responsive to discourse power of China. So now in January, we see these videos. Now we're beginning to call something a pandemic, right? We're saying it's going to jump over a little bit. And there really wasn't a lot of deaths, right? There just wasn't a lot of morbidity attached to it. Then we heard a lot about Italy, if you guys remember Italy. So Italy was January, February. A system that was already had a lot of difficulties. And that it was operating well over capacity. It had been underfunded for a long time, and it had a very unhealthy older population. So then around March 11th, we started hearing a lot of buzz about it. Angela Merkel comes out with a speech, March 11th. March 11th, Tom Hanks. I was just discussing this with a few journalists over the last few days. March 11th, Angela Merkel comes out with a speech saying that this is Germany's World War II moment. Okay, that was the language she used. This is the war on. Okay, so I get very worried about things that are described as the war on, but that's the language she used. It's also the language Trump used, incidentally, and a lot of other politicians have used. So Tom Hanks, Angela Merkel, and the NBA all use this same on the same day. We're in all the newspapers everywhere. Okay, all about COVID. Tom Hanks had exposure to it, he said. NBA player had exposure to it. So March 11th is also, or early March is also when Neil Ferguson came out with a very flawed report. Are you familiar with that, John?
Yeah, I read it.
Okay, yeah. Well, when you say you read it, what do you mean you read it?
I read the report.
How much of the report did you read?
The whole thing.
Okay. Did you have a chance to interrogate any of that report?
Yeah, I looked at it. It was being portrayed really strangely in the media, and the things that they were pulling up and the claims that were being made were really off. Because if you really looked at it, at least from my reading of it, is that if you applied various social distancing techniques and you could achieve the same thing that you would get from a full lockdown. And what they were saying, they were taking that report and saying, hey, this is a reason why you shouldn't use these techniques and that we need a lockdown, which was exactly opposite of what the report actually said. So I was, it was very disturbing. I mean, one thing I found in looking at all these epidemiological models and hearing how these epidemiologists think and the assumptions they make is that a lot of these assumptions are really flawed, and they were the models are pretty weak, and it's taken them way too long to update them. But you still can tease information out of them if you understand where the flaws are.
Okay, so can I interrupt you there?
Yeah.
When you say you can tease information, well, first, I mean, I'm not good at pronouncing these things. I have a little bit of a list. So epidemiologist or whatever they are.
Epidemiologist, yeah, yeah, got it.
I'm not even going to try. It's embarrassing. So whatever you just said, what's their academic background? I mean, what's required? What type of a degree is that?
Usually it's a master's or a PhD.
In
so
what? But in what?
Epidemiology. Yeah,
Okay.
It's a study of infectious diseases and on a population scale.
Are you sure of that? Are you sure of that?
No, my sister's an epidemiologist.
Okay, she's an but are you sure that that's a qualification required of one?
Well, actually, the interesting thing is that we saw a lot of people writing papers and making pronouncements on this that came from a variety of different backgrounds. So we see physicists, we see statisticians, we see people who are involved in general health. I mean, the volume of data being produced, and the volume of studies, and the volume of information, in a large part, drowned out a lot of what you get from the people who are professionals at this.
Okay, but
the professional models, so they were built on assumptions like, here's a good example, that if you have voluntary social distancing requirements and recommendations, that only 10% of the population would follow.
But hold on, John, we got to go backwards.
It didn't happen.
But we haven't agreed on what an whatever that
epidemiologist is.
Okay, yeah. And you have an advantage on me because your sister is one, so you're just used to saying it around the dinner table. I've said it 5 times in my life. Okay, I'd have to stay at home and practice in front of a mirror to be able to say the thing. So, but what is the academic requirements to be an I mean, can you go out there tomorrow and say that you are one of those? Can you do that? Why not?
It's a degree requirement. You get a degree in epidemiology.
Are you sure of that?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're sure that in order to do that, I don't need some other type of, I can't just self-proclaim if I have an academic background in, let's say, computer modeling, data sets.
No, that's not stopping people from actually making pronouncements and doing studies and claiming insight into the pandemic. I mean, we have very, very few examples of pandemics at this scale that really let people dive into building models for it. And this one was unique. And
okay, so hold on. Neil Ferguson, was he, by the definition that you feel is kind of the threshold, right? Was he, perhaps a degree, an advanced degree in virology or infectiology? Was he any of those? I don't know.
I mean, it was a model. It was a model that you could either take the assumptions as valuable or you're not. I mean,
but you want me to agree? Because this is an important point. Because when we're talking about this, it's really my question to you: is you want me to agree with the deaths that how successful we've been sequestering or not sequestering, or what we've learned along the way? But now, even just going to the beginning of this, we're looking at a report from a person who, by the rigid definition that you would like, right, the most authoritative one, which is some type of a degree in virology or infectiology, he is none of those things. That's not what he is. That's not what he is. I mean, that's not what he is. So I don't want to agree to anybody, to anybody's further argument. I think it's a dangerous thing. I mean, I want to agree because I'm an agreeable type of guy, but I fear being in agreement with something that originated with a report that was not from an authoritative source that was presented as such. And initially, Angela Merkel, which, I mean, you obviously picked up on, she said that something like 200 million Americans were going to get infected, and there would be a 2.2 million possible people dying of COVID.
Well, I don't think that actually okay. In general, we have a terrible way of communicating information in this country, and the bureaucracies, the health bureaucracy, proved totally incompetent in terms of coordinating their behavior, planning in this instance, and as well as the financial bureaucracy did in the financial crisis, and the foreign policy and military communities totally flubbed the Iraq War and the response to it, 9/11. And we're seeing that again and again, that these bureaucracies that we've built, that we've invested in, that all these millions of people that we've paid incredible amounts of money to and given respect to, can't generate high quality decision making anymore. And it's resulting in this environment. And we see projections being purposely hyped. We see people saying, like the CDC, it's saying that masks don't work.
Okay, but John,
back in March, because it is the noble lie to say, right, is that they're misleading people because they didn't want them going out and buying masks. I mean, that's just incredibly stupid thing. I mean, there's 100 years of infection control in hospitals that's built on. It's common sense.
But now it's interesting because Neil Ferguson, okay,
right,
was part of the research team that led to the culling of tens of millions of animals during the hoof and mouth crisis, where Britain just destroyed their economy by killing all their livestock. And it turns out that the data was incredibly wrong. Okay, just incredibly wrong that they didn't need to kill him. Neil Ferguson.
Again, bureaucracy messed up, right?
Yeah, Adam, I'm gonna step in for just 1 second. I think that we're all in agreement that a million people opined on this subject. There were tech people, statisticians, epidemiologists, randos, Twitter personalities, guys with a Medium account that wrote an article that got 50 million views and seemed to have changed the whole tone and conversation.
Right.
It was like titled like "Why We Have to Do Something Like Right Now," and it just went everywhere. I think we can also agree that the Neil Ferguson report was sliced and diced in ways that were opportunistic for people. I think we can also agree that Neil Ferguson has work in the past is questionable. I think we can also agree that at the Imperial College, they're also in the business of doing climate science modeling, and we know how that's going as well too. So I think that if we want to establish the fact that the data is unreliable and that our professionals and credentialed folks are also unreliable, I think that we're all in agreement there. I think the next question is who took advantage of this unreliable data, who sliced it in which direction, and to go which way and why. I think that's where we're headed. Is that not right, Adam?
Yeah, so, and I apologize, and I hope that wasn't antagonistic. It's a subject that I'm actively kind of like, but, and you're awesome, John. You know I'm a huge fan of yours, and it actually brings me to just the kind of the something I'm just so interested in, is how it now led off into how the media was able to get everybody sequestered for whatever reason, whether even if the intention was good or bad, or just a good or bad thing, whether or not, or whether even if we agreed or disagreed, how the media was able to get everybody locked up,
right,
good cause or bad cause, and now how the media was able to allow everybody to escape essentially into like this dark city world. And now they're setting up a media narrative. So I look at it, I'm a futurist, right? Even as a kid, I'm a financial futurist. I'm always I knew as a kid the world was going to change. I said, I want to make sure I'm on the right side of the tracks, because the other side of the tracks is going to be horrible, since I was a tiny little kid. And now I I look at it as our people operating system is changing, and I look at the current social movements that are out there as the triads that the Chinese use, just as very overt physical force. I've written a lot on Twitter and in my own personal life, a lot more about China and about its social revolution and kind of the four olds and how it was rolled in. I look at it as being identical. So I'm interested in how do you see that this is helping in the roll-up of power, and not only how is it helping in the roll-up of power, but who do you anticipate to be the biggest beneficiary? And once that has been accomplished, right? Once they've rolled it up, because they've only got a little bit further to go, they just pumped in $5 trillion into the market and whatever. Are they going to then dismantle it and let everybody live in peace and say, look, this is our new operating system, deal with it? Or are they going to say the only way that we can sustain our own power is to continue causing disequilibrium? Is the only way that we can preserve this, and that would require a lot more social agitation.
Great question.
Right. Well, I view it as a kind of a counter-reformation kind of moment for the neoliberal system. So the neoliberal system before was focused on lowering barriers to capital flow, lowering barriers to wealth creation, and that ended up concentrating wealth in the hands of very, very few people. And that what they gave to people, instead of the kind of middle class experience, the kind of income associated with that, is the ability to self-actualize, in the sense that they could choose their identity and they could travel and they could, there was no barriers, kind of usually moral barriers to fully realizing who they are and what they like to do. And it's money in exchange for identity. And that worked in terms of a power relationship for a while, as a replacement for the kind of middle class compact that had been in place during the Cold War, and now it's falling apart. And that's kind of a reformation moment where the Blue Church, Jordan Hall's framework, the Blue Church is now fighting back, and that is mobilizing and doubling down on the identity element in order to consolidate its power again. And except in this case, it's going to end up costing them a lot more money than it did in the past, and it's smashing down a lot of the protections it had set in place to kind of create this kind of uneasy relationship. Things like police and acting as a barrier on the dysfunctional system that we had. It's not crazy to think that the militarization of police that occurred in the 90s and then follow on accelerated in the 2000s occurred at the same time that the middle class started to fall apart, started to dissipate en masse. And that kept them safe to a certain extent, or kept that money intact. And now that's in question. Anyway, this is a consolidation effort. In terms of COVID, I think it was a lot more of a power consolidation opportunity around the world than it was here in the States. And in the States, Trump didn't buy into it, so it wasn't utilized in that fashion. It's more of a demonstration of the kind of network decision-making system that we have in place here. And we had a consensus movement where 60%, 70% of the population decided to do this, and the online consent preceded the news. The news is being made largely on Twitter and other places. You can actually see the reporters, the way they're processing the information, and they get on board, and then that aligns into the news. And then we saw that another consensus wave come through with the protests, and that shifted the attention away from the COVID response.
I think this is an interesting point you bring up, John, because it is sort of contrary to a notion of like a roll up of power in the United States. From my perspective and yours, and you've helped me see this, the decision, the mass acquiescence for lockdowns came before we were told to do it. I think that there was a sense among the people that they were ready, and it had been primed. Now, how did they get primed? Where did that information come from? Individuals have their own sources. We had our own networks. Our guys in the liminal order, we knew it was coming. We didn't know if it was the right thing to do or not, but we knew it was coming. Other people were primed and ready for it. And then I noted, and you know me, John, I'm not carrying water for Trump ever, but in this particular instance, it seemed to me he had an opportunity to be the authoritarian, dictator that everybody says he is, but he didn't actually. And I was very encouraged to see the response, which people called weak, some people, to be locally executed, state guided, and federally supported, which I thought was perfect. That seems to be the right language and the right idea and the right philosophy. So if to the extent that there was a power roll up by the red insurgency or the MAGA Trump administration, I don't see that happening.
Didn't happen.
It did not happen.
Can you just, I missed it. In terms of a power roll up amongst the red insurgent, I don't know what these terms mean.
The red insurgency was the network that was led by Donald Trump taking over the Republican Party and then taking over the federal government. They didn't use this opportunity as a way to consolidate their power.
When I say roll up of power, I mean I'm that's not power. I mean that's a brand. I mean I'm not talking about this. The trivial type of power. I mean, and it's very.
I'm talking about Trump having an opportunity to exert federal control over the states, send in National Guard, do whatever to do to norms.
So let me go back when I say power. Then let me kind of give it some. So I've looked at since for the last 10 years or so, this kind of transformation in our political, probably 20 years. But it's certainly accelerated this kind of transformation in our political system. Now, keep in mind, I have done a lot in politics. I've done a lot with some of the top players in politics. I've raised, I've bundled, I've hosted. I know everybody. They're all friends. I don't have a bad word to say. But I have watched the transformation, which is they're no longer powerful. They're powerful in terms of kind of the symbolism. But they're nothing in compared to the power of Google, the power of Facebook, the power. So I've seen this real transformation over the years that I've tried to describe, and I think about it as territorial sovereignty, which is I'm sitting here right now and, domiciled wherever, and I'm subject to their laws and I pay taxes to them, to a type of real functional sovereignty, which is, I'm using social media and I have to abide by their terms of service, and their terms of service is essentially, more convenient and something I have to fall within, and I have more interaction with it. I've touched it more frequently than I touch my own Constitution of the United States. So I take a look at the roll up of power, not as some type of a brand out there kind of grabbing a market share. I think about it much more with economic currency and social currency, which is the transformation of our people operating system from one that was kind of a republic, and whatever a republic is, in a way kind of a decompresses a republic, to now where we're in, we've exchanged, gleefully, people have exchanged terms of service for freedom of speech. I mean, so the power elites, Google has been lobbying, Facebook has been lobbying, Amazon. These people spend tens of billions of dollars, and pharma industry lobbies tens of billions of dollars. What are they buying, right? So they have taken over the judiciary, which is why certain people couldn't get indicted and this and that. And it's why they had to kind of charade Manafort or Stone people I don't particularly like, nevertheless. But they had to really put them on display because it's allowed to show all the people that to distract from all the people that weren't within a corrupt system. I know John on a podcast recently spoke about banking failures and why nobody went to jail and how this kind of led to a whole thing. But so I see a complete transformation of our people operating system that has happened kind of innocuous. It's not like it happened in China where they just ripped up the Constitution and they said the Chinese Communist Party Constitution now supersedes that of the People's Republic of China Constitution, which is effectively what happened, right? And in doing so, they stripped all the provincials and they said, screw it. You don't like Z, I'll tell you where you can go. Their form of deplatforming over there is, one day your dad's got a reasonably good job as a banker and he's been there or as a lawyer or this or that. Lawyers don't require any qualifications over there. So he's a lawyer or a judge. The next day he's picking grapes out of the field to go feed the bulls. It's really bad over there. We couldn't do that over here. So I see that they've employed these.
We can do that, at least on a network level. I mean, you can force people out of jobs. I mean, Jack's seen that firsthand. I just saw a guy.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a guy, a Mexican American guy in LA that got lost his job for just having his hand out a window. So it's like,
really?
They thought it was an okay sign, and they took a picture, put it on Twitter. Informed the company fired.
And that's why I'm such a big fan of yours, because what you're thinking has always, I think of myself ever since I'm a futurist, right? What's the world going to look like in 10 years, and where's Adam going to be in that future, and how can he kind of live a happy life where he is not burdened by. No, not anymore. Oh boy, not anymore. No. There's a lot of spots, but what we're seeing now is going to move to San Diego. I'm telling you, I've lived overseas. This is portable. This is coming wherever you go. San Diego ain't going to be that, unfortunately. So for you, is San Diego your spot? Is that where you're going?
Me?
Yeah.
No. I'm New England. That's where I'm stuck.
You're
my family. Yeah, my family's all there.
You've got a lot of more. You got a lot more natural barriers, right? You got a lot more natural barriers. Yeah, so you're awesome. So reason I've always been so intrigued with having conversations with you, and I know we tried to have dinner, in the years back when you were visiting your family here, I think your son, if I recall, is because your kind of thinking is kind of what I see in my head, but how do I now make this happen? So you're right. We are doing that same deplatforming that I've seen overseas. We're doing it here within our system, and that's what's always intrigued me about you. I recall in your when you had just first started your Patreon, one of the things you wrote about was how the gun movement, I don't know what it's called, like the NRA movement, or to deplatform people who have guns or whatever you call that type of a thing. But you said the banks are now going to be deplatforming people to enforce this movement to take away people's guns. Do you remember that at all?
Yep. You
were way ahead of the curve with that. And that's what I was thinking. How do they do this? I know where they're going to get to, right? Because I can see it because I'm a futurist, and that's what I think about. So, but you're the guy that kind of says, okay, I say, John, this is where I want to get to. How do I get there? I'm a visionary. I'm the entrepreneur. I'm not the operator, right? Two completely different skill sets.
Yeah, I'm also a entrepreneur, but I tend to, having been burned on trying to figure out where things are going to head, is that I look for actual instantiation, some little teeny example that points me in the right direction. So I'm not just theory crafting, which is always a fear of mine, that I'll end up building this elaborate theory that's based on nothing, and it falls apart at the first pushback. The whole deplatforming is done through alignment, and most people are still thinking that everything has to be done through legislation or has to be done through the government. That's not true. I mean, if you get enough corporations and individuals to align, and you can get government, it's not necessary. You can deplatform. You can get things done. And that's a form of power in a network age, and we're going to see a ton of that. In particular, in this instance, it's largely focused on equalizing power relationships with at least the intersectionals see as the power elite, eliminating their ownership of guns, eliminating their access to police, eliminating their access to jobs and wealth and power. There's that equalization is key to all of this. It could be a positive thing in that we're all kind of more on an equal basis, but it can be also used as a
well, so it's
debilitating
interesting.
weapon.
It's interesting because, again, what I've seen is over the last few years, corporations, the megas, right? Because they've all
Right.
consolidated, and there's only 5 or 6 content companies anymore. Almost in the world, there's probably only 10 of them anymore in the entire world that are effective. The rest are just kind of, just trying to rub nickels together, essentially, and just stay in business long enough until one of the megas acquires them, right? And there's only 3 or 4 pipe companies like Google, where they do all the plumbing, and Yahoo or whatever. There's just a few of them. So it's interesting because they've enlisted this phalanx, and the phalanx is working in service of them, because the argument of the phalanx is that Nancy Pelosi can't act quickly enough. Trump can't act quickly enough. So we don't care about the Constitution anymore because it's not responsive to us.
Right.
And not only is it not responsive to us as quickly as we need it to be, it's not like this Uberified type of, you've commented a lot on the behaviorification that we're seeing now and the change in behavior that's being built into people. But it's not only is it not responsive quickly enough, legislation, but it's also, they no longer have the physical proximity to a politician anymore. So for them, because they can't sit next to Pelosi anymore, right? It's not like it was 10 years ago, that they this experience of sitting across from power, whether it's Pelosi or whether it's Facebook, the only way Facebook is more available. It's more convenient to interact with Facebook power than it is with Pelosi power. So she's retreated deliberately. She's retreated from power, and in her stead, she's pushed forward, Facebook. Even yesterday, I think she said, people should demand advertisers deplatform Fox Media or whatever. I don't watch TVs, but I heard her say something like that on Twitter, where she is deliberately substituting the legislative power and constitutional power for this kind of territorial sovereignty, for functional sovereignty, where she's saying, listen, we're useless. Go to Facebook, do your
Right.
thing on Facebook.
Oh yeah, we definitely abdicated. You want to wrap things or?
Yeah, I was going to jump in there for a second. So many great things going on here. The one thing that's coming to mind is we're talking about using the networks to force alignment to affect change. And there's a couple of things happening. One, there's just like the decade-long consolidation of the Democrats into the corporate party, right? Matt Stoller has done a fantastic job of laying out how the Democrats gave in to Chicago right, neoliberal, market ideas. And when they came into power after Watergate, they just, for some reason, forgot about putting a check on corporate power. So the Google and the rest of the folks, they want to make sure that the federal government stays distracted and doesn't get involved in using their power to actually regulate trust. Matt Stoller, you should check out his book, Goliath. It's fantastic. I did a podcast with him. It's coming out next week. Now, the other thing about alignment and affecting change, I think I heard you maybe say, Adam, that it's not happening quickly, but I'm thinking it happened lightning fast. So we had the riots and protests in the last couple of weeks. Already we have seen in Washington, D.C., a whole slew of police reform legislation passed through the D.C. City Council without any public review. We've had New York City Police Department disband their 600-member plainclothes division. And I imagine that this is playing out all over the country all at the same time. So really what's happened is that Black Lives Matter, the phalanx, as you want to call it, whatever, they have become a political party with force, with billions of dollars supporting them. They're the most popular institution in America, practically behind the U.S. military at this point. And they're making change and affecting change in a real way very quickly across the country and achieving the goals that they want to achieve. And to me, it's scary because they're not elected. They don't represent the views that I hold. They have a contrary view of justice. And there's all kinds of other elements there that's kind of terrifying. But we've seen, and John pointed this out years ago, is this alignment between the resistance and the corporations, and they are together. They are operating together. They have their own plausible promise. I'm not sure what it is, but they are working together and in concert, and you can see it happening. And it's not always necessarily for like the immediate bottom line for a company like Nike to go woke or whatever, but it is for sort of long-term consolidation and for long-term ability to keep the government at bay, which they have been very successful at doing so. Ask Matt Stoller, a Democrat, he'll tell you all about it. And then also now affecting change immediately in local jurisdictions, actual cops taken off the street, actual police policies changed, actual money being taken away from police departments.
So that's what the corporations want. That's what they want, though.
Right.
I mean,
they're all aligned in this regard. Yes.
But so I never said that they weren't, that our political processes and corporate processes were not working harmoniously. Clearly they are. I mean, I just said that they've been able to use its phalanx to overwhelm. Back in China, it was called bombard the house, right? But during the social revolution, but they've used it to entrench deep political power, and then let that power retreat because they got sick of having to run for office anyway, and let all the corporate power run dominant. And obviously, they were doing this deliberately. I mean, defund the police to me, what it appears to is a corporate interest, because that money doesn't disappear; it's reallocated elsewhere. So whenever I hear that, I hear, well, where's that money going to go? And some small sliver of change will make its way into activist organizations and hopefully good of community evangelists and advocates. But you're talking about billions of dollars that's going to wind up someplace. And I'm much more interested, again, in where it goes. And it's going to go back to those same mega corporations. I mean, the interesting thing for me is that even just an example of this is that, they're creating all these GoFundMes to bail out people who are being arrested. And all they're doing is feeding the beast, right? It's like when Bernie Sanders said, I want to take away the system and it sucks. And they said, well, give me $200 million and now I'm going to beat up the system really good by feeding it. He thought he was going to feed it to death. Is basically. Yeah,
that's a feedback loop. I mean, there's synergy between corporations and the network movement. And it's not being unlike China, it's not being led by the government. It's not being dictated by the government. But this new system, network and corporate power combined, I think it's being led more on the network side, but the corporations are opportunistic and they're taking advantage of it because it allows them in many ways to operate unfettered as long as they censor, as long as they help the movement along, help the network grow and get powerful. My fear is that over the long term is that what we should be aiming for is a dialectic, a kind of a back and forth between a consensus idea that this is what we need to do together right now, and a dissent that can dismantle it when it shows weakness and when it has expired, which largely has been on the right, for the last 3-4 years, and what we're headed towards, and the stronger movement is that when a network gets locked down, when a network becomes consolidated and it becomes rigid, and that it doesn't allow the kind of free association, freedom of ideas, and we become rigid and non-productive, and things don't get started, things don't get done, and we die as a society. We die in terms of creating prosperity. We die in terms of producing progress and producing forward movement, because nothing outside of rigid kind of area of ideas is allowed. I mean, if you go outside of that, you stray, you're immediately shot down. You're at risk. And so that creates what I was calling the kind of the long night, is this kind of network authoritarianism, network dominance, network totalitarianism, where it has one idea that it puts into action, and then it's locked down through censorship that gets into every single conversation. Everything we talk about is guided in support of that, and we don't even have any mechanism for stopping that from happening. What are you going to do? You're going to take down a global corporation with 3.5 billion people connected to it. It's not doable. And once we get locked into that, we have AIs that they get better every day in terms of making that possible, finding those little nuances in the conversation that are going in the wrong direction, that are operating against this kind of network think.
It's interesting. So it's interesting. I apologize. There's a little bit of a lag. I apologize if I interrupted each other.
Oh no, go ahead, please.
So it's interesting because I've kept this log for years into Trump's presidency, because I saw the world. It was very clear that they weren't going to allow another insurgent. I mean, that doesn't really require too much thought to know that was going to be a challenge to an elite system. But so I saw that over the last 2 years, and I always, I would tweet it out, but I'd write a lot of notes about it myself, is that the spectacles at the Colosseum I study a lot of Rome, ancient Roman history, I guess you could call the period, but nevertheless, a lot of the period of that time, prior and after. And that spectacle, I would say spectacles at the Colosseum would always get larger. And, clearly there was become the expectation of the mob, which is what you were trying to kind of satiate there. And you needed a bigger and bigger distraction because underlying kind of the social conditions just kept on deteriorating, that you needed to kind of give people some type of safety valve and a release from that. And, they did a pretty good job of it. And even up until medieval times, they, continued to do that, where, the elites would give back, at least periodically. They would give back once or twice a year, and they'd say, here's a big festival, right? And now we're seeing every single, I look at it episodically, right? We're existing in a time of like everything is a sitcom show or a police show. And we're going from episode to episode, and each episode, the amplification, it's like on Spinal Tap, where it just keeps on going up to 11 and then 12. So we saw Russia, 2 scoops gate, where you had 2 scoops. And then we're seeing just louder and louder and louder and more people emotionally engaged. That I do think about, once this dies down, which clearly that movement for the time being is no longer, I was just doing a Google search on it now just to see what type of volume it had. It's definitely died down. The velocity of Black Lives Matter searches, everything else has definitely died down. Now we're seeing more of COVID. So we're going to get back to a COVID hysteria, which is fine. I mean, if you can anticipate it, I can buy stocks they're going to benefit from. But then what happens next? Are we going to now continually go through these episodes where they have to get louder and louder and louder? I mean, at what point, even if, let's say, Biden wins and whatever the Democratic attachment to some of this is, perhaps not even ideologically, but just through convenience, right? Can it be turned down? Or are we just now going to look through these endless, loops, whatever your language, your military language? Are we just going to see more and more episodes becoming more and more louder, and therefore agitating more and more? And then just kind of like, is the media just going to continue sending out these like beacons to agitate people more and more to get them to go into the Coliseum and participate in the spectacle?
Right. Well, we'll keep on having complex crises that slam us, that our bureaucracy is unable to deal with. And with each one, it offers an opportunity for people to consolidate power and for disruption to occur. What we're seeing, what we saw with the protests is more of a pattern lockdown. I mean, we're kind of post-ideological now, and there's not really an ideology driving it. It's more of a kind of a big pattern, like kind of the way QAnon works in a kind of smaller scale, but writ large, that lots of people contribute to and lots of people enforce, and that each of these events reinforces that pattern. It allows it to grow, it allows it to get more complex, gain more adherence, where people spend all their day just watching the news kind of go by them on Twitter and Facebook and other things, and they pick out the things that actually match that pattern, and they paste it and share it, and they go, okay, look at this, it's a new one. And they know the moment they see it, even the headline, exactly, it fits. And if you try to show them that the headline doesn't mean what they think it means, they are completely unable to change their mind on it because it fits in the pattern. And changing that would have to would force them to kind of confront the pattern or disrupt the pattern. So is it going to get worse? Of course it's going to get worse. But our challenge is to figure out how to use this mechanism, this network decision-making system, kind of that's serving as a little bit of a replacement for nationalism as we go forward in terms of what it can do in terms of cohesion. I mean, within the consensus, it is pretty cohesive. How do we regularize it? How do we when we started big markets and financial markets, how did we turn them into something that was useful instead of disruptive and destabilizing? I mean, how do we turn bureaucracies into something that actually, do things that are beneficial?
Is that something that you can actually do with an open source insurgency and these networks that coalesce? Even I'm going to use the word. Sorry, Adam. Even Black Lives Matter and Antifa, they come apart, they go together. They come apart, they go together. You're the expert. I don't see how. Oh,
how they're instantiated. McLuhan would say, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, how we get out of this long term, at least McLuhan's framework, is that we turn our society into an artifact. I mean, a technological artifact is that we use that to manage everything. And what we're really doing right now is really just fighting over how that artifact is built. And then it will be AIs, that would be social AIs, and they would actually end up running how we interact.
So I've had some really interesting conversations with folks lately. I did an interview with Joe Norman yesterday, who's a complex scientist, specialist, PhD, written papers with Nassim Taleb, way ahead of the curve on COVID, and looks at all these issues. And we were talking about regulating biological entities, their regulation response to viruses, the barriers that they erect, how permeable the barriers are, and how that relates to us with social media and memes and fake news and viral spread of information. And we were talking, not happily, but talking about how in the future there may be regulated social media networks that have like fail safes or tripwires that prevent the spread of some of these viral fake news or viral information that causes this kind of disruption. And that's totally in the same vein, I think, of having AIs manage our social networks. But for the medium term, for right now, what I'm more concerned about is this sense that the federal government is losing its power. The traditional political parties are losing their power. Black Lives Matter appears to be one of the most popular institutions in America at this time. It's operating as if it were a political party. They're making demands. They're getting response out of the federal government. But it's not an official party in the sense that what we're used to. And they can make demands that the rest of us don't want. And then because of the alliance in between the resistance and the corporations and the blue church, they're able to enact their legislation overnight. It was like in 2 days they had legislation done, and there's going to be more legislation coming. So I'm seeing this as like a natural phenomenon that we can't control. I mean, it's like the mob on steroids, ultra uber connected.
It's not just the mob, John. It's not just the mob, Jack. It happened before, not just with the civil rights that were intruded upon within COVID, but it also happened. I didn't have an opinion on Russia Gate, whatever it is. I just thought it was interesting to be an observer, to be a speculator too. But it was amazing how quickly it happened, how quickly all the legal processes were thrown out the window, redefined, how quickly punditry was on TV saying something absurd, which was just, just some absurd things. And with Ukraine Gate, I guess it was called, how quickly they were able to get to an impeachment. So it's not just the social movements that are able to act violently, by violent I mean quick, but able to act quickly to move things. But our own political apparatus, when they choose to, can move even quicker.
When it leverages the network, when it leverages it speeds everything up.
Or when the network leverages the
so which leveraged which? So John, which leveraged which?
The overall driver is the network, and as that pattern builds. But I mean, it doesn't stop opportunistic corporations and politicians from taking advantage of it. It's a contingent leadership, though. It's a contingent opportunity. You have to align in order to take advantage of it. I mean, you just can't decide one day, I'm not going to align anymore, and then expect the same kind of support.
But the movement towards socialism is nothing new within America. I mean, I remember the New York Times print. I'm a capitalist, right? I remember the New York Times printing things 10 years ago, and I want kids to make money. I want everybody to make money. It makes the world a better place. And I remember, and I've seen socialism and I've seen communism close up. So I remember the New York Times writing op-eds by academia there saying how wonderful communism is, and Google Talks for the last 15 years or whatever has been having a lot of academia come in to these little $200,000 a year kids, telling them how bad capitalism is.
Right.
So,
but they're not attacking it directly. Do you notice that they actually are staying away from it because that's something that hasn't proven capable of getting a consensus support. So they're attacking it indirectly and achieving the same thing. I mean, how do you change the composition of corporations, change the composition of boards, change the composition of who gets employed and how much they make, and all of that? That's an indirect method of achieving the same thing. But if you go after wealth and directly, you run into the opposition.
Okay. But if Google did not allow that, I like Chris Hedges. I've read a lot of his stuff, but he gets a little bit annoying with this stuff after a while. And I remember him and some of his colleagues going to Google Talks and saying how they want to burn down capitalism.
Right.
Now, so the irony speaks for itself, but couldn't Google have squashed that if they had just not permitted Chris Hedges in their doors? So couldn't they have just deplatformed Chris Hedgians, because he has already obviously been deplatformed anyway? But
they don't see it as a
can't
threat.
They just deplatform?
They could, but I mean, they don't see that as a threat. And there's no call from the network to deplatform them. There's no benefit to. You don't get alignment points for deplatforming Chris Hedges.
But if there was a call they
do it in a second. I mean, if they'll take somebody out if the network calls for it.
But why can't they populate the network's messaging?
I just don't see the mechanism. It's like, create a viral meme right now, and then have it go and get 100 million people tomorrow. And if that was possible, then people would be doing all. Yeah, I mean, but it's possible.
I can give you recent examples because I'm chronicling all of this. I have seen it. I don't know whether I'm not one of those CIA conspirator type of people or black operations type of people, but there is definitely now where you can take inadequate, just nonsensical type of things and give it a life beyond what normally would have been organically possible through like a Reddit type of upvote type of thing. So they can create something that looks authentic, that's not. I mean, and so my question to you then is,
will they be able to?
Yeah, 100%.
Well, if they're in control of actually designing and implementing the artifact, if there is a social artifact, if there is a social AIs that could manipulate us on a global scale, then of course they're going to be in the driver's seat longer term.
So let me give you an example. It's very interesting, right? This happened recently. Is Twitter announced that they caught like 200,000 bots or fake accounts or whatever, and of China that were propagating, diffusing, Chinese propaganda or trying to create social dissent. And it's very interesting to me because I'm a little bit skeptical of that. I think that it's certainly possible that they did, but it's also certainly possible that it's just kind of a convenience that they can throw into the wolves, in order to let the other 99 escape. Because the ones, social, when you see an account on Twitter, right, the first thing you might look at is how old is that account? It's like a vintage, right?
Right.
But so if you see something is 2020, May 2020, that has 5,000 tweets, you're going to say this is not authentic activity, right? Clearly, this is part of kind of a synchronized, group. Now, if I were to see an account from 2009 that's timestamp 2009 that's got 5,000 tweets, it's going to look a lot more real. right?
Right.
You're not going to think too much about it. You might say, hey, whatever, but why can't Twitter? I mean, it's their program, right? This is their shop. Why can't they mess with the odometer and put false mileage on the car?
Right. No, most definitely they could do all of that.
Okay,
I mean,
so
it's just and all of this inauthentic activity, meaning this external manipulation, is all, I think, greatly overblown, at least within the context of the U.S. It's just that our internal discussions create so much noise that anything that Russia and China could do is just really just lost. I mean, they could spend 100 times what they're spending now, and it would still not make a dent, because we are so freaking noisy and we're so good at it. The quality of this of the stuff that's coming at us, I mean, in terms of trying to manipulate each other, is intensely good in many instances.
What would happen if Twitter just stopped that? If Twitter just closed that valve? So, for example, I'm just going to give you an example. Let's just say the current social movement is Black Lives Matter, okay? And what were to happen if that were just closed? If Twitter had just closed off, and Facebook and all the other 4 social, 10 media companies had just decided to close that valve.
All right,
Adam, they're closing valves all the time, just not the ones I want them to. They're closing valves all the time. They close a valve on me. It's in the terms of service right now that they can elect to show your tweets to people. There are people disconnected from following me and Scott Adams and everybody all the time. There's third-party apps, we think, actually, that you authorize that people are infiltrating to disconnect you and your network. I mean, it happens to me. I have good friends that there's no way they unfollowed me, but they were forcibly unfollowed. So Twitter is fiddling with all the tubes and all the valves and everything, just not in the direction that I may want it to go.
Yeah, and if they started to try to go after groups that are affiliated with the Consensus Network, is that they'll get internal dissent. I mean, the employees will explode, because, I mean, one thing about these networks is that they can infiltrate bureaucracies, corporate bureaucracies and government bureaucracies, and then go down in the layers. They have people who are, it's not so much even an ideological kind of infiltration. It's just, I am aligned with this network, and when I see damage to it occurring inside my organization, I will raise the flag, and then I'll gather the network support to try to attack the people who are trying to implement it. It's tough. It's not a
gotcha. But can't Twitter, and I'm asking, I mean, I don't know the answer to this, so it's just, can't Twitter just fire those employees? I mean, they just continue going clicks deeper?
They don't want to.
For example, when you're hiring, okay, but when you're hiring an employee, right, in a regular corporation, you're asking them to do a lot of different personality tests and to do personality profiles so they can be better managed, and you can kind of observe what type of character and kind of the best tools to help manage that person given that type of personality they have. They can also hire, that's kind of an indicator, or kind of a leading type of indicator. They can also hire according to kind of their willingness to not participate in these type of social causes.
Adam, they're deliberately screening for people who will participate in these social causes.
No, I understand. Yeah. What I'm asking, John, is if they want to shut it off. If Twitter wanted to shut off the valve, close off the valve to, let's say, for example, Black Lives Matter, could they?
I mean,
I think it's part of the corporate culture.
If my aunt were a man, she'd be an uncle. It's like, I don't understand this question. They don't. They're aligned with the resistance. They screen their employees. They train them to think this way. They incorporate it into the algorithm. It's part of their friggin' mission. They've been taken over.
I mean, Twitter has to do what's in its own. I understand. Okay. I mean, that's, I hate to say self-evident, but we've all on Twitter. We all know what's going on within Twitter. They have to see. I don't think about it as left wing. I think about it as they're doing whatever is best for their own financial interest. They've got fiduciary obligations to improve shareholder returns.
Left and right doesn't matter. It's that old dichotomy is not really true anymore. It's this pattern that we're dealing with.
Adam, I want to ask you a question. Do you really believe, sincerely, that the 100% of the motivation of corporation board management and staff is to maximize shareholder value?
But when I don't know how to answer that in the way that you framed it, because I'm not exactly sure what I'm agreeing to. But yeah, I do think that fiduciary obligations of a company come first. They've got to do within their own best shareholder return interest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
If that were only whose phone, if that were only the case, I don't think that is necessarily the case anymore. I think there's been a misalignment. In some ways, I wish that they would just exclusively focus on the bottom line. That would drive a lot of different decision making. I believe there's no one. I mean, look, they just took off the Federalist and Zero Hedge off of Google advertisements, which is actually money straight out of their pocket, because they've just had a different ideology. Now, maybe there's an analysis to be made there that they would lose other advertisers, and net it was best for them, but I don't think that that's the case. So I think, Adam, from your perspective as a Wall Street guy, as an investor, someone who depends on boards to be focused on shareholders and on profits, you need that to be true so that your worldview works. But I don't think it's true anymore.
But let's look how it jives with John, okay? Because what John's articulated is kind of this network and kind of how it immerses with itself within a system and how it infiltrates within a system, and how it's very disparate at the same time, right? But so that same network also attacks the board of directors and the largest institutional shareholders of Twitter, right? They're not only going after Federalists. I mean, Federalists, I like Federalists. I even said something about it yesterday. It's obviously wrong, but it's a very small operation. Now, but if I'm that network and I want to inflict damage and impose real authority, I'm going to go after the largest institutional shareholders of Twitter, and I'm going to say, unless you do this, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to go after.
What are you going to do to the Saudis? Saudis on Twitter, don't they?
Well, let's just keep it high level.
Okay. Well, I understand that, but I mean, some of those major shareholders are also aligned with the resistance, and they also have their own motivations. I wish there was such a clearly set of incentives and alignments that we could apply logic and necessarily to this circumstance, but I don't see it. And maybe that's just me. I'm not working on Wall Street, and I'm not a network specialist, so it just strikes me as not necessarily the right frame of reference to try to understand what's happening.
Perhaps, but again, if we're only looking at a few different corporations, and we're taking a look at a GDP of a couple $1 trillion that can kind of allocate that money any way they want, whether they want to subsidize broadcast of CNN in hotels or in airports, despite nobody really wants to see. Who the heck wants to see CNN in an airport? I want to see some Tom Cruise movie or something. Show me yeah, exactly. I don't want to see come on. So, so if the government chooses to pay a premium to have in airports, in the authorities that have jurisdiction over the airports, to show CNN and pay a premium for it, well, then CNN's going to do what whoever is controlling that purse string for the person in government. So, this happened within TPP, and there's lots of, I think that everything is downstream of politics. I don't, John would argue, John and I have an interesting contrast because he thinks everything is kind of downstream from social, right? And I think everything is downstream from politics. And I don't think we have a disagreement. I think we're just trying to establish which came first, like the chicken or the egg. I don't know. It's a age-old question.
Yeah. We're approaching 2 hours here. This is usually the time where I like to wrap things up. Most people's stamina is about this long, mine included. So I want to give you guys an opportunity to make a couple of final statements. Adam, you want to go first in a couple of minutes, and then John, I'll give you a chance, and then I'll say something, and then we'll wrap up this amazing experiment in a 3-way podcast with John Robb, Adam Townsend, Jack Murphy Live.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for being such a wonderful host. It's really awesome, and I've really enjoyed it. And I'm thrilled to speak with John. I'm a huge fan of John. We shot him 4 years ago. I subscribed to his Patreon, which is awesome. And some of the things, it's funny because I read these things and I'm like, John can't be right. Oh no, oh no. And then he's right. And I'm like, darn it. Why couldn't he be wrong? I didn't want that to happen.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I know. I know. And so thank you again for that. My own interest really these days is just kind of being the archivist for what's happening within what I think of as the fastest roll-up of power in human history. I'm a huge kind of Roman era history buff. I've spent wonderful nights kind of replaying war battles and writing things about and reading things about the currency and the devaluations. It's so fun to me. And it's so interesting for me watching things go from kind of Alexander the Great to Augustus within such a short time span. So I like being an observer of it. So thank you, Jack, for hosting this. It was so thoughtful. And thank you, John. You're awesome, and I'm a fan. And Jack, congratulations on Matt Stoller, because I'm a fan of his also. Although we disagree about Boeing, just so you know. If you haven't done it yet, kind of battle it out because he's wrong about that. But
right.
Thank you both so much.
John?
Well, thank you, Jack, for hosting. Thank you, Adam, for suggesting this and getting this all put together. It's been fantastic talking to both of you guys. Wow, it's really cool to be able to dive into topics like this and not get run into a stone wall. Usually, you run into somebody's like, "Oh, it can't exist," or "This can't happen," or "This is impossible," and it's usually they just have a cognitive filter to prevent them from seeing it. We're all immersed in this. We're all super savvy in terms of knowing what's going on and seeing where it's going. And to be able to do that for 2 hours is a real pleasure. And thank you so much, guys. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you very much. What I do appreciate is we all have our own perspectives and backgrounds and even hopes and dreams. But the thing that brings us together is pursuit of truth and pursuit of trying to figure out just what's going on and how to figure out what's going to happen next, irrespective of right, wrong, or otherwise. So thank you guys very much for that. I really appreciate it. Everybody out there, thank you so much for listening. Check out Adam Townsend on Twitter, John Robb, Patreon /John Robb. Join that. That's the best Patreon on the entire planet. And you guys, please follow me at Jack Murphy Live on Twitter, jackmurphylive.com, and come down, check out the Liminal Order, liminal-order.com. Thank you, everybody. Guys, I will talk to you both very soon. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, guys.
Cool. Bye. Thank you, Jack. Bye-bye.
Thanks.